Welcome to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. My name is Kristen.
And my name is Katie. And we want to spend a few minutes a day with you walking through the New Testament, one chapter at a time. This year, we will fix our gaze upon Christ so that we may know him, not only with our minds, but with our hearts.
Together, we will learn that who Jesus is changes everything. Welcome back to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. If you are new here, we are diving into the entire New Testament, one chapter a day. My name is Kristen Schmucker, and today we are in Matthew 16. There is something so special about the Gospels. I think it is just this glimpse that we get into who Jesus is. I kind of feel like I just can't get over it, and each day I am learning something new, even though I've read some of these passages many times before. Today's passage begins with the Pharisees and Sadducees testing and trying to trick Jesus. It is interesting because at this time period, these two groups of people didn't really get along. But it seems they came together over a common enemy, as people so often do. These religious leaders could look at the sky and know what the weather would be, but they could not see Jesus. They asked for a sign, and yet they could not see the greatest sign of all time, the incarnate Son of God who fulfilled every prophecy of Scripture, who was standing right in front of them. Jesus told the disciples to be aware of the leaven of the Pharisees. The disciples' response deserves the palm to the face emoji because they just didn't get it. They thought Jesus was talking about bread, so they started talking about how they had forgotten bread. Not only had they missed the point that Jesus was talking about the teachings of the Pharisees and Sadducees, they started stressing over bread. They forgot that Jesus was the provider. 2 days ago, we read about how Jesus fed the 5,000. Yesterday, we read about how Jesus fed the 4,000. And yet, these silly disciples had again forgotten. I kind of think it might be funnier if it weren't for the fact that we are so often just like the disciples. How quickly we forget his goodness and grace. As we continue in the chapter, we come to a question that is posed from Jesus to the disciples. Who do people say that Jesus is? The disciples tell him that some people think he is John the Baptist, like Herod. Others think he is Elijah or one of the prophets. People were taking notice that he was someone important, even if they didn't know who. But then Jesus asked the disciples another question, and it is a question that every person must answer. Who do you say that I am? Jesus wants to know the disciples' answer to the question. It should come as no surprise that Peter is the first to answer. Peter says, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Peter tends to open his mouth a lot, but this time he nailed it. Peter recognized with the word Messiah that Jesus was the King, the long-awaited promised Messiah who had come to rescue those enslaved to sin. And he also recognized that Jesus was the Son of God, God himself come to dwell in the midst of humanity. Jesus responded with blessing for Peter. Peter's name means rock in Greek. So Jesus tells Peter that he is the rock on which the church will be built. We know from other portions of Scripture that Jesus is the foundation and the chief cornerstone of the church. But here, Jesus acknowledges that Peter will have a unique role in the early church. Peter had just confessed to the central claim of the apostolic faith that the early church would be built on. The gates of hell would not overcome the church. Though the attacks come today just as they have for 2,000 years since these words were written, we can be confident in the words of Christ. The church will continue and will not be defeated. Peter would lead in the church despite his failings. In several chapters, we will see Peter deny Christ. But just a few moments later in this chapter, we see that when Jesus tells the disciples that he must go to Jerusalem, suffer, be killed, and be raised, Peter says, "No, Lord, it isn't going to happen." After telling Peter that he was the rock on which the church would be built, now Jesus says to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." Yikes. Peter's strength of faith did not come from Peter. It came from the Lord alone. And yet God used Peter in such a powerful way. What hope there is for us as the imperfect children of God. The end of chapter 16 is a call from Jesus for anyone that seeks to follow after him. The call is to deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow. It is a hard call, but this is the call of discipleship. The cost of following Jesus is high, but the reward is great. Jesus reminds the disciples that the pleasures of this world do not compare. There is nothing on earth that is worth the cost of losing one's soul. So Jesus calls us to follow him. As we behold Jesus today, I am reminded of Jesus as our provider. 3 chapters in a row, we have seen Jesus providing bread or reminding us of his provision. He will satisfy us with himself, and he will not fail us. He is the Messiah, Son of the living God, just as Peter proclaimed. He is the Lord of all, the Redeemer and God incarnate. We behold him as merciful. Peter's wavering faith was not beyond the reach of his grace. He is the one who willingly suffered in our place. He knew that he would be killed, and yet he went. Finally, he is the one who is calling us deeper into relationship with him. He wants us to be passionate disciples of himself. He never lets us down. We can rest in that truth as we go about our day today.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. Don't forget to check out the show notes for helpful links and resources related to today's episode. And make sure you are following at Daily Grace Podcast on Instagram for more A Year in the Bible content, and at the Daily Grace Co. for all things Bible study resources. We can't wait to study again with you tomorrow. Bye, friends.